Hi, everybody, and welcome to Unions Are the Mycelial Network of the Environmental Movement, the lengthiest title of this entire conference, probably. We're so happy to be with you in community today here virtually. My name is Erica Prather, and I live on unceded Tohono O'odham lands, which is otherwise known as Tucson, Arizona. So bringing the desert heat to this panel today. We're going to talk about a lot, but I wanted to actually open with a quote that one of my union comrades shared with me. A Memo for Labor by Ryan Eckes. You cannot separate the job from the house, from the rent, from the earth, from the food, from the healthcare, from the water, from the transit, from the war, from the school, from the prison, from the war, from the water, from the house, from the healthcare, from the war, from the transit, from the school, from the food, from the job, from the prison, from the rent, from the earth. So I think that's why we're having this panel today, is there is no separateness. And we're going to explore the synergies of labor and environment. I also want to call really quickly that my birthday is on Earth Day, and Ray, who you're going to hear from later's birthday is on May Day. So we're officially the Earth Day and May Day crew, otherwise known as Green Union Hall. And we'll get into why we call ourselves Green Union Hall and what that means in a minute. So yeah, so why are we running with this theme of mycelium, besides the fact that mycelium and fungus are really cool? Originally, we had done this panel as part of the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference in Eugene, Oregon. So trying to be super place-based, but not too far from where Cal Poly sits. But there is what's called the humongous fungus in the Blue Mountains, just outside of Eugene. And it is the largest known organism in the world. It is an organism that is thousands of years old, many dozens of miles wide and long. And one thing that, I think a lot of us that do this type of work, this type of work is environmental justice work. I think sometimes a little bit that there's somewhat of a spiritual crisis going on where we're kind of detached from like these deeper intrinsic vibes in our work. And one of those things that I certainly love a lot, and I know my fellow comrades of Green Union Hall, is introspection through biomimicry. What can we learn from other organisms? How can we embody other organisms in our work and really deepen our hearts in the work? So running with this mycelial theme, because mycelia have been on this planet for millions of years, have infinite wisdom, and we're going to draw lots of parallels in a fun way throughout this panel with how unions at their best can act like mycelium. So the next slide, our panelists, I'll kick it over to Mireille here in a minute, but I know I introduced myself and where I live, but the expertise I'm bringing to this particular panel is I've organized 2 unions in the environmental space. That's what we're hyper focused on with our panel today is, kind of the new surge in unionizing workplaces of the environmental movement specifically, and the nonprofit sector largely. But the first union I organized was with Defenders of Wildlife, organized Defenders United, and then most recently I organized Wild Earth Guardians, and our union is called Wild Earth Workers. So that is a little bit about me, and I'll kick it over to Mireille and the rest of the panelists to introduce ourselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mireille Bajani. I use she, they pronouns. I'm currently the co-executive director of Slingshot, which is a regional environmental health and justice organization in the Northeast. So I'm based in Western Massachusetts on Nipmuc and Wabanaki Confederacy land. And in my previous job, I was on part of the group of organizers who organized the Public Interest Union at the Public Interest Network, which is a national network of organizations that includes the US PIRGs and kind of Oregon Environment California, those kinds of organizations across the country. I'll pass it to Danny.
Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. My name is Danny. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a climate and energy strategist at Breach Collective, which is a unionized, worker self-directed nonprofit organization working, broadly speaking, on climate, energy, and labor campaigns. Breach was established out of a unionizing campaign at my previous employer, Our Children's Trust, which was a climate litigation nonprofit, and a bunch of us who unionized that workplace later decided to form our own nonprofit organization. As part of my role as a unionized employee, I have served kind of in a ad hoc role as both an organizer and bargaining agent for my local, which is the Communications Workers of America 7901. And that includes helping organize units at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon and Civil Liberties Defense Center. And I'm also currently negotiating a contract on behalf of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. And I will pass to CJ.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. CJ Garcia Lintz, she, her pronouns. I am in Lansing, Michigan, on the land of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy. I am the president of Progressive Workers Union. We represent staff at Sierra Club, where I work, and also Union of Concerned Scientists, Appalachian Voices, Greenpeace USA, and 350.org. I've served a lot of different levels of union leadership, and I've negotiated several collective bargaining agreements. And I'm really excited to be in collaboration with my friends at Green Union Hall, helping other organizations unionize. I am going to pass it to Ray.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ray Lee. I use they, them pronouns. Before my current workplace, I helped organize the Evergreen Workers Union affiliated with Communication Workers of America 7800 at Washington Environmental Council and Washington Conservation Voters. So one side being the statewide policy organization and the other side being the political organization. They are now Washington Conservation Action. I'm from Coast Salish lands. And I will stop.
Awesome. So you might be wondering how we all know each other, because none of us have ever worked at the same organization or unionized the same workplace. So how on earth did we all come together, also across every single continental time zone? Well, back in 2022, we were all part of launching something called the Earth Day to May Day campaign. It was a little micro event where all of the different sort of newly formed unions in the environmental space came together. We had realized that a lot of our organizations were using the same union busting attorneys, which we'll get into all that drama here in a bit, and that we were all wanting a lot of the same things in each other's contracts. So wouldn't it be cool if we started building power, talking to each other, and really kicking off that whole effort by elevating each other's voices every day from Earth Day to May Day? And so that was sort of the first time we all came together, which then evolved into what we call Green Union Hall. And I'm going to let Mireille take that one on.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Erica. Yeah, we all learned a lot through organizing our own workplaces and being in communication with lots of other groups going through similar challenges, as Erica mentioned. And it became clear to us as time went on that more and more nonprofit workers are wanting to unionize their workplace, but a lot of unions don't have the staff and infrastructure to support this big wave of organizing that's happening, and they're not really taking on new campaigns. So we decided to form the Green Union Hall, a place for workers to learn the basics of unionizing, to build relationships across organizations, to be in solidarity as a broader environmental and nonprofit movement. And so we've been hosting workshops, office hours, happy hours. We're bringing the quintessential union hall, the heart of worker power, into this post-COVID era. It's online, it's national, and it's focused on the nonprofit sector.
Alrighty, so we kind of broke this into a couple different sections, like where we're at, where we're going. And I think we really have to talk about, before we can talk about all these generative spaces of how awesome it can be, all the fruits we can bear with labor and the environment partnering, we have to first address some of the barriers to success. And that means we get to talk about union busting. Woohoo, everyone's favorite topic. So when you're forming a union, when you're organizing a union, which hopefully a lot of you that are on this webinar this evening will contact us afterwards and say, hey, I want to organize a union in my workplace, and we'll help you with that. You learn about union busting and the kind of classic 3Ds: deny, delay, divide, which are there on the left. But I sort of ran with this anti-environmental analogy that union busting in the environmental nonprofit space specifically demoralizes our movement. It makes dumb financial sense, and it dulls our possibilities. And so this is, I think really important again to address, because there might even be folks that are on this call tonight that are bosses that are curious as to why their workers are organizing. And I think that that's something we're going to talk about on this next slide too, is the ways that our bosses do coordinate, sort of like our unions, the workers, we're talking, and that's really cool. But we know our bosses are also, unfortunately, not in the right way talking and working together. If people want in the chat, we did this in live. It was like kind of like a game show, but would love to hear if anybody knows the answer to this. I'll just give it a minute. What do these nonprofits and corporations have in common? On the bottom, very obvious corporations we all know and despise: McDonald's, Apple, Starbucks, Delta Airlines. Justin is very close. I'll half give it to you, but see if anybody else can get a little more specific. And on the top, there are logos of some familiar environmental nonprofits: Defenders of Wildlife, Animal Legal Defense Fund, Audubon, National, and Southeast Alaska Conservation Council. Yep. So you guys basically got it. They all use the same union busting law firm, Littler Mendelson. Littler Mendelson is one of the premier, most expensive, egregious union busting firms. And I think that that's worth mentioning, not just because it's appalling that nonprofits are mimicking behaviors of corporations, but also what that is signaling from our movement, right? Like Littler Mendelson at the federal level is lobbying to undo and weaken labor laws. And so for the environmental movement to be associated with that kind of behavior is pretty appalling, and is really not signaling, a leftist movement. It's pretty far right. So these are some different headlines from really the last year and a half, so quite recent. Some of them are very personal to those of us on this panel. You're going to hear from CJ, president of Progressive Workers Union, about some of the Sierra Club stuff that's on this page. The top left one is a High Country News article about me. I was illegally fired from Defenders of Wildlife for organizing a union. And so this just again, I think a lot of people are really shocked when they see that donor dollars or grant money that should be going to address the climate and ecological crisis are going into the pockets of union busting attorneys who are making a niche of how to beat down workers and environmental nonprofits. And it's just such a waste of all of our time. So let's see here. Yep, the next one. Here we go. Woohoo! Love the graphic on the left, because I often hear, it was funny, when I got my job at the current job I have, people were like, well, maybe that place doesn't need a union. And I'm like, every workplace needs a union. It doesn't have to suck for me to want worker power. And I think, like, running with the theme of this entire conference is, how can we give agency to some of the most marginalized people in our workplaces, in the world, in our communities, and the people who really have no power. And in this situation, it's like, yeah, even if you don't have a toxic workplace culture, having a union is a total antidote to a lot of the things that we feel in the nonprofit sector. Burnout, loss of agency, not great pay, all these things that we're going to address throughout this panel. And the photo on the right is, we're going to talk in this union busting section about not just this high level stuff that I mentioned, like, hey, they're all coordinating and using the same attorneys, but like, what does that look like? And my example, my personal story is one of the starkest, most obvious, blatant sort of like, let's make an example of this person and cases. And others are much more subtle. And in some ways, the subtle ones can be harder and certainly harder to spot. But for me, the image on the right is from a Politico article about my termination. My mom actually caught the moment I was fired while I was trying on my wedding dress. My wedding dress actually had these really cool sleeves. You just can't see it in this photo. But I was back home in Kansas, and Defenders of Wildlife knew I was at home trying on my wedding dress, and they were bargaining over my termination with my union. And I asked my rep, do I have to pick up the phone when they call me and tell me I'm fired? And she said, no, I'll just text you. And so that was pretty surreal that my mom caught that image. But I think that it's important to give voice to this because these are real consequences for real people that this affected not just me and my mental health and my finances, but my friends, my family, my community. All the work I was doing in Arizona was deeply impacted by my termination. And so that's my personal example of union busting, and we'll continue to hear more.
So there's a reason the reason why there's a jaguar here is that we were using this like language of like subtler, so it's not like outright like aggressive. There's like a sort of a deniability, plausible deniability to some of the union busting tactics that we see in the nonprofit world. And I experienced it in my workplace, but we have been seeing this actually across so many different workplaces. And so I'll just talk about one example, which is co-opting and weaponizing movement language. So as you may already know, language is used as a tool to exert dominance and uphold hierarchies. So there is a pattern emerging where groups of positional power weaponize language of the oppressed and marginalized. We've obviously seen this in popular culture, but within the nonprofit industrial complex, they co-opt movement language without having the practice, or even worse, being fundamentally at odds with the idea at the heart of language in order to borrow cultural power and moral authority. And why does this happen? This is because a nonprofit's org identity, right, is based on being progressive, being well-intentioned. So they can't actually do explicitly bad and aggressive things that you see in, the big sort of corporate world. But when they do, like in Erica's case, they come up with justifications, right? Because they have to protect their reputation, both externally, as in when they're facing their donors, or internally actually to uphold like their organizational identity around their values. So this actually is an example of where white supremacy culture within nonprofits like really come into play. So this actually might look something like you, quote unquote, you are causing harm to marginalized identity of management personnel. But harm, as we know, is not hurt. You have to have a systemic power analysis down that axis. And sometimes this is unintentional, where the internalized oppression has not been unpacked, and sometimes it's actually quite strategic. And even in the corporate world, we've actually seen how DEI tools and language and structures, such as affinity groups, have been used to defer concerns, divide workers, and surveil, as is the case with Starbucks and Amazon. And I'll pass to Danny for some more examples.
Yeah, and I might take advantage of the fact that we're on Zoom to just pop them in the chat. But there's two sort of classic ones that come to mind. One is from a few years ago where REI opened a podcast between, I think, several executives at REI a conversation that was essentially just anti-union propaganda with a land acknowledgement. So we can sort of see an example there of using the terminology of social justice and decolonization to launder union busting tactics. Similarly, only a few weeks ago, we had a spokesperson for leadership at the Sierra Club accusing the majority BIPOC union leadership at Sierra Club, the Progressive Workers Union, of engaging in anti-blackness. So again, sort of deploying these things in a very sort of defensive way to deflect from their own behavior. And it's frustrating to see these kinds of tactics, but it's not particularly surprising. And it's not surprising because nonprofit management is conditioned by a number of factors to behave in this way. And some of those factors include the makeup of their board, which is often, and other members of leadership, which are often handpicked or at least highly controlled by an executive director or small leadership team, by their compensation. I think in a number of organizations, we've seen, frankly, nonprofit compensation get completely out of control and start to, match the for-profit sector in terms of its sort of largesse. And that leads to people seeing themselves as superior to their employees who actually carry out the programs of these organizations. And what's ironic about this is that, this is exactly what the largest foundations funding these nonprofits that are often funded by some of the most ruthless capitalists in the world, often coming from places like the tech sector and other extractive industries, want. They want power concentrated in a single figurehead. They want that single figurehead to be accumulating power and insulating themselves from accountability within and outside of the workplace so that they can control the agenda of those organizations. And unfortunately, this is why non-white or BIPOC leaders of nonprofits can often be sort of instrumentalized in a way and be very effective union busters, because their identity can be used to mask these, broader structural factors shaping the behavior they're seeing within these organizations.
Yeah, and I can kind of build on that with, some of the ways that some of the frustrating things that we've experienced as organizers in environmental nonprofits in particular. There are a lot of practices within their organizations that are based in colonialism. For example, Sierra Club outings are very much rooted in colonialism, and we've, as union members, have been able to try to push our organizations to do better, to change some of our practices, right? To ensure that our DEI programs are not performative and that we're actually living by, the Hermes principles, and we're really trying to remove some of these traits of colonialism from the workplace. And we've seen it come out in various forms, to, from like how your manager thinks your desk should look, to how people think an employee should speak or talk, like if they don't speak like us, or, in quotation marks, I'm got my camera off because I have unstable internet, right? They believe that people should speak a certain way and write a certain way and present themselves in a certain manner. That's all very much rooted in white supremacist culture and colonialism. And we've filed grievances over this. We've had members of PWU who have been unfairly penalized because they are English as a second language speaker, and when their manager becomes mad at them for one thing, they retaliate by suddenly like, oh, your grammar is a problem, the way you speak is a problem, the way you're writing is a problem, the way you dress is a problem, right? Like the dress culture. All of that is really challenging, and also, like, from the work ethic, it's taken a lot of work to kind of help deprogram people who've been led to believe that we have to be willing to sacrifice a living wage, and family sustaining wages, and good work-life balance and affordable health care and dignified work environments because we happen to believe in the cause, right? Or because we are dependent on the mission of our organization for everyone to survive climate change, right? There's also questions about, like, who has the power in an organization and why, why does the board of the executive team suite, why are they believed to be more deserving of power and a voice in how an organization is run and how the work is done when it's the usually the represented staff on the ground in communities who are holding those relationships and doing the work. So like PWU works to push decolonization in workplaces in a way that our organizations are not quite ready to yet.
And I think another piece here in the challenges bucket, and another reason that unions can be so important in nonprofit context, and one of my biggest motivations when I was unionizing my former workplace was to combat turnover and burnout. There are so many young people who have their first experience in organizing through the public interest network, through campus chapters, through canvassing during summer jobs, or their first job out of college. And so they see this culture of being overworked and underpaid and all of the cultural, a lot of what CJ and Ray and Danny have been explaining, in addition to being surveilled and tightly controlled, as par for the course in an organizing career. And then they decide it's not for them. And we really need to be building a powerful movement, especially if we're going to succeed in pushing back against white supremacy and colonialism. So we need as many young people as possible supported in becoming great organizers, opening up the door as widely as possible, not making it seem like it's a job that's only for the elite, privileged, and selfless few who can cut it in this kind of cutthroat and challenging environment.
Alrighty, we just wanted to kind of take a pause and see if anybody had so far any questions that came up. It looks like somebody just put something in the chat. And while we took a minute to read that, also would love to hear in the chat from everybody if you want to participate in a way that unions have done something for you while we take a minute to read over this. But what are something, that unions have brought to your life that you're stoked on, to just make sure we're all together and awake?
Erica, I do see one question in the chat from Justin that was asking if prevailing, oops, it just moved on me because someone typed something in there. I believe it was our prevailing wage unions helpful or harmful. Let me see if I can find that again.
I've got it, CJ. Prevailing wage unions such as IBEW helpful or harmful in relation to overcoming union busting in the nonprofit sector?
So this is my opinion and others can chime in. I feel like it's helpful because when wages go up across sectors, that provides data that proves that, it is possible. And, it kind of sets a norm. So we've seen a lot of the things that have been accomplished by UAW and some of their big pushes really having effects throughout organizations. When I've been at tables with nonprofits, we have used prevailing wages that were won by other organizations to help us. And really, I mean, the onus should be on the organization, right? Like they clearly have profits and they have the ability to ensure that they are paying people a living wage. A lot of nonprofits will publicly state that they want living wages for people taking new clean energy jobs or in other communities, and they'll call on other sectors while not providing that same thing for their own staff. And so like we found it to be very helpful because global solidarity really is the key to survival of labor. And I'd love to hear what my colleagues think.
Yeah, I think a rising tide lifts all boats. That kind of sums up what you just said. So I think that's like even seeing it's like any push for a 4-day work week, it doesn't really matter who's doing that. Whatever union's pushing for that, it normalizes it. Just like, I saw weekends, but whatever, 8-hour workday, paid time off, sick leave, all of these things that we enjoy in a workplace were not given by a benevolent manager. They were pushed for by workers. And when it happens any place, it's a domino effect. So yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, and I'll just add in my own experience as someone who has a lot of friends working at different organizations and who also is involved in organizing a number of those organizations that I've seen, at least anecdotally, managers at other nonprofits that are not unionized approach their staff and say, in a more active way and seemingly explicitly or implicitly, to sort of, avoid or sort of head off a sort of unionization effort, saying, hey, what kind of like improved benefits should we be trying to like, fundraise to give you? And, like that is a sort of more benign form of union avoidance that we see out there. And that doesn't mean that those organizations shouldn't unionize, but I do think it parallels what we're seeing in the auto sector in the moment, where UAW won a bunch of big gains at workplaces in the Midwest. And now we're seeing, non-unionized factories in the South offering those same benefits in an attempt, hopefully unsuccessfully, ultimately to stave off unionization there. But it does, when it's a demonstration that unionization improves paying conditions across the board, given time. And I did have some thoughts on Thomas's questions and the sources he shared. The stuff about employee ownership is really interesting. As I mentioned, my organization is modeled as a unionized worker self-directed organization. We don't have EDs or a clear management team, but we work with the board to sort of co-manage the organization. And that's a model that we're really proud of sort of pioneering and still working through. There are some really great examples like the Mondragon organization in Spain that is also a very similar model. So yeah, I think that's a very positive thing that, isn't necessarily something that an employer has to negotiate with you by law, but is a conversation that can be opened by unionization as a strategy. And then I'm now blanking on the second question. Yeah, it was sort of about baby boomers owning a bunch of, a lot of organizations. We unfortunately do see this in our sector as well. I have noticed one of the things that leads to union busting is founder syndrome, which is when people can't just separate themselves from an organization, their mission, and they don't really realize that it's time to move on and take a sort of emeritus or senior status within the movement, and they just hold on to power because it's so wrapped up with their identity. So I think we do see that same trend in this sector.
I want to, David asked a question that we're not going to quite get to today because it's kind of the next stage of like, it's one thing to unionize, but how do you force the nonprofits to the bargaining table? And that's a whole other piece of work. When you do unionize and either gain voluntary recognition or win a union through a vote, management is required to bargain in good faith on a certain number of mandatory topics. So they have to engage with you to a certain degree, at least on those mandatory topics. Going outside of those topics and trying to get a more comprehensive bargaining agreement takes a lot of, it's continued organizing. Like the organizing work, the power building work isn't done when you win your union. You have to keep having your coworkers show up and keep exercising your collective power and whatever other leverage you have. At the Public Interest Network where I used to work, we won our union over 2 years ago, and they're still bargaining their first contract. So it can definitely be a slog. And that's where continuing to lean on alumni networks and powerful relationship with powerful people who have leverage over the organization, and making sure that all the workers are staying together and are aware, new employees are aware of the union and getting recruited into what's going on. That is, if anything, more of the battle than getting the union itself.
I just wanted to touch on Santiago's question about private sector. I mean, the question was specifically with a private school. And I will say, I've had this really interesting contact with Catholic Labor Network. That's because I wanted a giant inflatable rat for a protest outside of the Defenders of Wildlife building after my hearing was over. So I got connected to Catholic Labor Network in DC because they had a huge scabby. Anyway, I learned that they are actually really helping private Catholic schools and their affiliates organize and, make an interesting claim that that's a Catholic value. And the other note of that, as I saw in my hometown of Wichita, Kansas, is where the Ascension Workers, which is a private hospital, Catholic hospital, they just recently organized. And I think that hits on a really important thing I hope everyone takes away from today, is that every worker has the right to form a union. I think that we have endured so much brainwashing in this country that we think that we don't have that right, but like we literally all have that legal right. And so I think on that note, and then also just like, yeah, we're not going to get to all of these today. And we can come back to them when we're done with kind of the next section, but someone's question about like low wage workers and restaurant workers and all that. What's interesting is some of those folks have even shown up to Green Union Hall just because they're our friends or in our network. We don't limit ourselves to providing organizing, I don't want to call it advice, but basically a platform to discuss how to organize exclusive to nonprofits or green groups. People can show up to Green Union Hall that work in any sector, frankly. And I think the more that happens, the more we can learn from each other and get even better at what we do and build a lot of amazing power. So I don't know if any of the other panelists have anything to add before we move on to the next section, and we'll come back. These are great questions in the chat, so please keep putting them in. All right, we're going back to the mycelium analogy, back underground, where we're really going to dive in and say, and some of it's actually answering some of the questions that I think are in the chat about like this new movement and why it's important specifically for the nonprofit sector. So here we go. Mireille is going to run with this one.
Yeah, so this is our extended analogy of how unions are like fungus. So mycelium are decomposers, and similarly, unions can break down white supremacist culture and structure. So we really need to break down the old ways of doing things, the white supremacist and colonial movement culture that needs to be disassembled for something better to emerge. We know that the way we're doing things doesn't work. And so the process of creation of a new system requires destruction. We need to be able to examine what's holding us back before we can move forward. And the nonprofit industrial complex brings in a lot of that white supremacy culture and in the status quo of just like how a lot of these nonprofits function. A big piece where that shows up is around resource scarcity and this idea of scarcity, that nonprofits can't afford to pay people enough. So instead, organizations have an approach of hiring as many people as possible for as little money as possible, rather than investing in longevity and really building up their staff, building up their staff's skills and confidence over time. That same idea of scarcity also gets applied to information, and that nonprofits are unwilling to share contact information, and they have these proprietary lists of their supporters, of their volunteers, that they're unwilling to cooperate. On a campaign that I was running here in Massachusetts statewide, there was an organization that was unwilling to share, like we were trying to get as many petition signatures as possible, and an organization wanted to help with the petition effort but didn't want the signatures they collected to get mashed into the full list and lost in the full list. And so they needed to set up their own separate systems to collect their own signatures that would later get added onto the full list, which is ridiculous and just makes it more of a headache for everyone. And also this idea that we're all competing with each other for funding, that there's scarcity there, and so we're unwilling to share relationships and tips rather than actually building power together and cooperating as a cohesive movement. In addition to the scarcity piece, another big part of white supremacist culture that gets pulled into nonprofits that we need to be decomposing is urgency. And that leads to pushing staff to overwork, especially when it comes to environmental campaigns. The climate crisis is so urgent that we have to do this right now. At my previous workplace, a young organizer was told that she couldn't take a 3-day weekend to visit her partner in the hospital after a surgery because the campaign was too important. And at that point, if a 22-year-old organizer can't take a 3-day weekend, then there are some deeper questions about the stability of that campaign. And this is just not how we defeat corporate power, which is almost always what we're up against in our advocacy and organizing work. As Adrienne Marie Brown lays out in Emergent Strategy, change starts within ourselves at the smallest scale within our own circles, this fractal idea of, we start within ourselves and that builds out towards bigger change. And so how can we shift the balance of power in our society if we are within our nonprofits are behaving more and more like the corporations we're fighting? So unions can be a key part of shifting that trend and undoing, decomposing that work. And I'll pass it to CJ for some more examples.
Yeah, so I mean, all the organizations that I work with at one point or another were very grassroots oriented and now have become very, grass tops down in how they approach the work. That just doesn't really work when you're trying to actually serve a community with equity. It's taking away the power from the people who were supposed to be using our platforms. You can see it in the way that an organization will enter or exit a community. It's very much like a colonial approach. Not only how we enter and exit a community, but like how we work and support and pull resources to make sure we're being the most effective as an organization can be, because every organization wants to have their brand and their stamp and own everything, rather than just like, okay, like we're just making stuff happen. We have a platform, we have resources, we can share those, and that's not what's happening. And so unions have really started pushing, represented staff have really started pushing to have more of a say in how we enter and exit a community, the way that we treat our partners. It's all hugely rooted in colonialism right now, and that has to shift in order for true equity and true environmental justice and true labor justice to happen. I'm going to pass it over to Danny.
Yeah, and what CJ's describing really is a sectoral trend. And as I mentioned before, this is a sectoral trend in part because philanthropy is becoming more top heavy. There is evidence to support this, that organizations are being funded by a smaller number of wealthier, larger dollar donors. And this leads to a loss of community accountability when you have a more distributed donor base. When you are a nonprofit that has a large member base, there is a certain degree of accountability that comes from that. And I'll just note, in the case of some of the more high-profile union busting instances we've seen in the nonprofit sector in the last few years, it doesn't appear to have had much effect on those organizations' bottom line. So we know where the doning class, where the owning class, where they sit on these issues. They either don't care or they tacitly support it. And unfortunately, this means that we're seeing a loss of accountability in the sector. So unions, in contrast, can be a new or additional vector of accountability for nonprofits and make sure that they stay true to their mission. Some of that accountability is legally mandated by the National Labor Relations Act, and some of that can be fought for by exercising the collective leverage that we have as workers.
Yeah, a pretty good example of that is Sierra Club. PWU was the first union in the United States to come out and demand a ceasefire in Palestine and stand in Palestine solidarity. For a long time, members of Sierra Club units of PWU had been calling on Sierra Club to end the way our outings are carried out in Israel and other places, because they are very much rooted in colonialism, like I've said before. And there was a lot of greenwashing, and it just wasn't appropriate. And there's been a lot of pushback from our organization to move in that right direction. But as a union, we are not beholden to funders the way our union is. Sierra Club was very concerned about like funding that we get from Bloomberg and other organizations who would see that call as anti-Semitic. Even today, Ben Jealous was on someplace. I saw he was live tweeting something about the issue with campuses and the riot police coming in and breaking up protesters, anti-war, anti-genocide protesters. Sierra Club has still yet to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. He was talking about how he was arrested for fighting apartheid in South Africa in his youth, has still yet to call for an end to apartheid. So, like, what business does he have out there calling for that, right? As a union, we're able to push in a way because we are not our accountability is not the same as what Danny just spoke to.
Further extending our metaphor, mycelium can remediate soil, and they do this through enzymes and by detoxifying pollutants in the soil. So we say that unions can start to clean up the polycrises of the 21st century. So we talk about how unions can help catalyze and transform existing systems, right, that are capitalist, that really just is like really deeply rooted. So just to kind of show an example of this, I'll talk about my workplace, Washington Environmental Council. Well, actually, first of all, you have no protections at an at-will workplace, right? So in a lot of nonprofits, the leadership will say, you should speak up. And, this could be your BIPOC upper management also saying, you should work with us to address these workplace issues. But with the way the hierarchical structures are set up within nonprofits, you can't, because you have no structural power and you easily could see material consequences for speaking up. You can get fired. We have seen this happen, right, with what is happening in Gaza right now and people speaking up about it, right, because the capitalist structures are aligned with Zionism and with settler colonialism. So in our workplace, in my ex-workplace, when we found out that the organization was doing a 180 pivot on its stance for a cap and trade bill, which they rebranded and called it a cap and invest bill. And this happened over the course of a weekend through a public partner call out. Workers used internal channels to say, hey, isn't this something that we've already agreed upon is a racist false solution for our climate crisis? And this led to retaliations for several workers under a thin, pretense. And, there were a lot of other issues that kind of came up as a result of that. So unions help provide balance to remediate that hierarchical power over that is designed into these white supremacist, colonial, and heteropatriarchal structures. And I'll pass to CJ.
Yeah, I mean, over and over again, we see how the elitist mindset of colonialism impacts how a company or how an organization treats their employees. Like, you're going to take what we give you and be happy with it, right? You shouldn't be asking for more. We need, we have more important things to pay for than the people who are actually doing the work, right? But we've seen over and over again how pushback from unions can eliminate those, right? We can fight for those living wages. We can reduce educational, degree barriers, like to promotions and to jobs that are like requiring a degree where a degree really isn't necessary, and that prevents you getting staff who really reflect the communities that you are serving. There are just a lot of other tools that we use as unions to push back on those colonial ways that sort of prevent recruitment, and it prevents retention of talent. And when you start to treat your staff with colonial practices, they become very unhappy, morale drops really low, and people start fleeing. You lose institutional knowledge, and you are not able to achieve the goals and the missions of your organization.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about some of the kind of external examples of this. So when we talk about the polycrises of the 21st century, it's like, okay, what does that mean? I think it means, yeah, all the ways that these systems, like we're just seeing all of them implode and do what they're supposed to do, right? And so I think that sets us up for false solutions. Jobs versus environment is the one that we're the most familiar with. And so in terms of remediation externally, I think that this translates into a one-on-one worker-to-worker conversation. So in my current job, I work on a landscape that has a lot of extractive industry that's pretty common in a lot of rural America. And so rather than seeing the workers at the lumber factory or, the fracked gas plant or the coal plant as the so-called enemy, unions are a way that we can have a worker to worker conversation. It's been my goal to, through my job, not just talk to, the greenwashing entity, that owns that plant. There's literally from my job, a coal plant that's coming offline in 10 years. And, it's like, oh, okay, I can hear all the talking points from that business about like, well, we're in the community and we're talking to families and seeing how we can like keep jobs here and blah, blah, blah. But that's the company. We need to be able to talk to the actual workers. Our organizations love making these big, grandiose, just transition statements. And yet I know virtually, and I don't know anyone really that's out there on the ground having coffee with somebody that works at the coal plant. And I think that there's something really powerful there, in terms of class consciousness and realizing when a worker to worker conversation that we likely have the same enemy, it's that worker's boss, and that like these workers are not the enemy, they're not the problem. In fact, I would argue that, unions are a way that those, in that kind of conversation, like that specific example is a way that that person could be heard because, since I see this all the time in my job in rural Arizona, these are people that have been left behind by both of our political parties. And they feel very forgotten and alone. And it's really wrong for our movement to not reconcile with the fact that we are taking away jobs and like, and what does that actually look like? So I think that that's a really powerful way when we talk about remediation, of the potential looking forward. If we can stop the union busting, have recognition of our unions, embrace labor, we can have those conversations and also build our movement, frankly, because the environmental movement has lost a lot of political relevancy and ability to connect with people that live on those landscapes, that we're, trying to protect. And so this is a really powerful way that we can dial in on that. And I'll hand it over back to Ray.
Yeah. So just to close out this section, right, like what we've actually all seen within the environmental movement is that by just keeping our view on sort of like the conservation lens, right, because the environmental movement was built on like white supremacist and colonial framework, right, like this is actually not going to get us to resolving the root issues of these like massive interconnected crises, right? So we actually need to join forces with the intersectional movements, and we need to address capitalism. Like we are actually, again, back to Gaza, like seeing that right there where Western imperialism, neoliberal capitalism, fossil fuel interests deeply interconnect and support settler colonialism and genocidal racism. Okay, on that note, I will pass to Mireille for the next analogy.
Thanks, Ray. This might be my favorite one, that mycelium are decentralized. And so unions can create models to share power rather than having this top-down dynamic. In general, decentralized systems can be so much more powerful, so much more reliable if we're thinking about from an energy perspective. A lot of my work currently is around the electric sector, but when it comes to workplaces, we don't have democratic workplaces. There's a lot of hierarchy, top-down decision-making, a lot of bureaucracy that your boss has to ask their boss, has to ask their boss for permission to do something. And so unions can be a really good opportunity to experiment with consensus decision-making and to shift power around in the organization. So even just within the union, it can be a space for everyone to have an equal voice in decision making. So at my union at the Public Interest Network, we operated by consensus on a 5 to 5 scale. So at every meeting, we put up our scale and said, this is what 1 through 5 means. When we make decisions, everyone gets to vote. And everyone who came to those organizing committee meetings got to have a say in what we were doing next, regardless of how long they'd been at the organization or, what department they worked at within the organization. And so it also, because we were a national organization and we were kind of siloed in these different spaces, it was incredible to get to know our coworkers and feel like, wow, we're really working together towards common goals and we're able to collaborate on that. And within unions, it's also a space to create values that can permeate into broader organizational values. And kind of tying back to that fractal idea of creating at the smallest scale what you want to see replicated more, more largely. And at our union, we drafted a list of values of like, this is what we want our workplace to be like. It's not currently this way, but we're going to treat each other this way and really cultivate this space. And then it'll spread outwards from there. And so we had values around anti-oppression, open and proactive communication, recognition and appreciation, respected boundaries, and joy, which isn't always something that we talk about in our work, but is so important. And at each of our meetings, we would talk about these values and uplift examples of how they'd shown up in the last week so we could really turn it into reality. And a really big part of the decentralized power thing is also that unions can be a buffer from staff directors' whims. So if you have a good staff manager right now, and you have a good relationship with them, that's great. But that is dependent on them. And 6 months or a year later, if they leave and you have a new manager, that can be a whole different dynamic. And so solidifying culture and workplace practices can protect you from that. And I think that Danny and Erica have some examples of that as well.
Yeah. So we're extending the mycelium analogy here and talking about how mycelium can send nutrients back and forth. And what we mean by that is that mycelium are a communication tool between trees and the forest, and they can also serve as in the same way that unions can serve as a communication tool between organizations, between climate campaigners, people working on these issues, and the working class and frontline communities. And this is important because we know it's a long-standing corporate tactic to drive a wedge between, on the one hand, environmentalists and frontline communities, and on the others, workers and jobs. We see this in the timber industry, we see this in the fossil fuel industry, and we see it essentially in all extractive industries. And the reason we see it is because it's a pernicious and often very effective trope, and it's one that's difficult to dislodge if campaigners don't find ways to engage with unions, engage with unionized workers, and understand their perspective. So, speaking personally here, one thing that during the labor movement has really done for me is it's made me realize that at a minimum, our campaign goals can't be blind to this, and really they should be, offering workers, it's an overused term, but a just transition, or at least offering policies that benefit workers, that create meaningful livelihoods for workers and improve the community in a sort of holistic way. So in two policy areas which I work, which are building electrification and public power, those are areas where there are unionized workers who stand to potentially lose jobs or lose work from policies that would better overall affect the community. So one of the things we have to think about is how do we, extend an olive branch or give them a lifeline as we make this transition that we know is necessary for the planet and for the climate. And so, for example, at a recent public power conference I went to, we had a whole morning session focusing on how to better connect with labor for this very reason. Two of the other things that unionizing has done for me is that it's given me a better understanding of how unions are structured, and that there is in fact a difference between engaging with the rank and file of a particular union and engaging with union leadership. And often it can be a better tactic when working on a particular campaign or a particular policy to engage the rank and file, because they may be much more amenable and less beholden to other power structures than union leadership. And that's been really productive in some campaigns. The other thing it's made me think about is the ability we have to influence our own locals in our own districts, our own smaller levels of organization as unionized workers ourselves. And so in CWA, we have ski workers, we have telecommunication workers, we have workers from a bunch of industries who may also have perspectives on this that we can, appeal to and build power with.
Yeah, and I'm just going to quickly touch on, because it's interesting in the chat, there's like a lot of theory, and that's totally cool. But also, like, what does this look like IRL, and like what are the benefits, and so like my example with that is actual conversations I've been able to have. Again, if we're in the headspace of like, okay, we're all change makers, we're trying to build power with all different kinds of groups, and a lot of us may or may not, be trying to assist communities or bring in communities or partner groups that aren't necessarily right in our neighborhoods, right? So I'm out in rural Arizona. Someone doesn't really want to talk to me because I'm coming in from Tucson. I've been called a carpetbagger. That's fine. Don't take it personally. How can I break through that? How can I actually approach with humility and have a real conversation with a real human being in person where we're hearing each other out? And again, I feel like, this is a way I've had these interactions. So the coal plant one I mentioned earlier is one that I'm working on, contacting the union to get a hold of workers. But when I'm out building support for a land protection campaign, and I come in as this outside organization, it's just a bad look, and it's parachuting, right? And so I think that, again, like whenever I've been able to have conversations with workers and ask genuine questions about what's going on here, how are people making ends meet, what do you all need, that sets the stage for a genuine relationship. And none of the change-making work that we do is ever going to be achieved through anything but relationships. And so having a common language, a common way to show support, like to be able to stand in solidarity in a picket line with the workers who are on strike at a coal plant, that's a really powerful thing. And I think it's really scary for those corporations. And, circling back to how we started this whole panel, like how do we defeat corporate power, these entities that have so much money and influence? And as Malcolm X said, we are not outnumbered, we are out-organized. I don't actually think we're out-organized. I just think we're outspent generally by like big dollars. And the more that we can find each other and find these pathways to talk and share a common language around working class values, I think it's a really exciting way for us to, as the slide says, achieve class consciousness and solidarity in a very genuine way that's not just artificial.
All right, so taking our metaphor one step further and changing tacks a little bit, mycelium also act as an extension of trees' root systems. And we analogize this to the fact that unions are an extension of the organizations whose employees they represent. They are not third parties. And we, going back to some of the union busting tactics, this is a very well-known union busting tactic that employers use to try and create a separation between the union and the organization. But unions are not a third party, they are the workers themselves. One of the other things I've seen management do is, point to historical examples of particular unions that have not acted in a just or equitable way, or have even engaged in discrimination or racism, as if that is somehow indicative of how all unions behave, which it is not. Those unions made very conscious choices to behave that way. Unions have also been, and there are a number of historical examples of unions behaving in just the opposite way. And I think that just goes to the fact that a union is ultimately what you make of it, and that therefore the potential for unions in progressive sectors, in nonprofits and other organizations working to improve their communities is quite profound. But unfortunately, this is also a symptom of essentially the kind of class solidarity, if you will, that exists between the managerial class. And I think Erica has a really good example of this from her past employer that she may want to share.
Yeah, this is a little comedic bit that, Defenders of Wildlife, the union that I helped organize, they are years into collective bargaining and ongoing union busting. And most recently, the CEO of Defenders, Jamie Clark, literally sent a letter to the president of OPEIU, the union, and said, from one CEO to another, how do I work with the union? And it's like, you talk to the workers, dude. That's the whole point of this exchange. That's the whole point of doing this, is that you sit at a bargaining table and you talk to the workers. You don't talk to the CEO. That's so absurd that the way of thinking is literally, it's mind-blowing to me that someone would ever even think that way, but that indicates the level that the CEOs think they're at, that they're only worthy to talk to other CEOs. And I think that that's fascinating because we have no business issuing DEI statements and saying, oh, we're going to do all these amazing things and partner with these more marginalized groups when the CEOs can't even turn around and talk to their own workers. It's our last slide. CJ, do you want to go ahead and take this first little point?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this before. Plants are stronger and fuller with a more abundant mycelium. Organizations and companies are stronger when you have a well-supported, well-connected, unionized labor force. We've already talked about unionized retention. The 3 B's of pro-union are belief, buy-in, and belonging, and the more mechanical benefits like higher salaries. Some people have talked about profit sharing. Some of that can be achieved, as we've seen the big three in some of their contract negotiations. Other things that the unions have fought for successfully in our collective bargaining agreements have allowed us to work through issues that deal with toxic workplace environments and avoid mission creep and overwork. So really having a really strong union makes your workforce very sustainable. There are things that avoid burnout. There are things that avoid, managers. They create pathways for success. They create pathways for promotion that sometimes we have seen are really difficult to come by when there are not collective bargaining agreements in place. I think it's also a great way. We've seen huge strides taken in the amount of, pension benefits, 401ks, 4-day work weeks, all of that, right? And so if a stronger organization really is able to move their mission forward a lot better when you have a happy, well-protected workforce.
And I think or Erica, did you want to say something before I round us out on this slide?
No, you do it.
Okay. I just want to circle back to what we said before and that graphic that Erica had around you don't have to hate your job to want a union. That unionizing is an act of care. It takes so much work. It is, and we are already, as we, have said in a number of ways, a lot of nonprofit staff are overworked and underpaid, exhausted by doing our regular jobs, to say nothing of then engaging in an entire union campaign. So we don't do it just because we feel like it. We do it because we really care about the organizations that we work for, and we see that they can be a lot better and a lot stronger, and the movement can be so much stronger with a unionized workforce. And so really what can help us move forward is moving away from this mentality that it's us versus them, and instead see that this is a tool that can strengthen all of us, that can strengthen our organizations, can strengthen our work towards the goals of our organizations, and that we engage in it because we care so much, not because we're trying to tear down the organizations that we work for. And then I think we have a slide about the Green Union Hall and how to get in touch with us. Maybe? Right? Do we? Or no? Oh, Erica, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I just want to say that the environmental nonprofit union logos are very cool. No, but really they are. A lot of amazing workers that Ray, didn't you design one of these? Yeah. So one of these is designed by our very own Ray, and this is an exciting thing. It is a lot of work. It is a lot of, you know, all the things we talked about, but it's not going away. It's here. I think that that's something that you know, all of the bosses hopefully learn, and also the workers, with how much work it is to be in community. I saw one comment that said, how does the union help you make friends? And I was like, man, I don't know, but it's definitely one way to help you see who your coworkers really are. Because when you're in community in a union, I've often said the only friendships or relationships as intimate or like your best friends or are your partners, because you really see how each other you know, show up. And so this is just a little bit of a snippet of, yeah, the unions that have come online within the last couple of years. And I know the next slide is a way to get in touch with us, and would obviously love to see your logo on the slide when we come back and do this next year. So Mireille, take us home.
Oh, I don't know if I am, but also follow us on Instagram at Green Union Hall. We can put that in the chat. That's where we post about, oh, there it is. So you can scan this QR code, follow us on Instagram, email us at the Green Union Hall email address, and that's where you can find what we do monthly, the first Thursday of the month. So this actually fell on our usual Green Union Hall time, but every first Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, we rotate between workshops, office hours, and happy hours. So join us next month, and stay tuned for, you know, and reach out to us if you have any questions, if we can help you with your workplace. So we do have a bunch of time for questions in the chat. I do want to really encourage folks to put questions, like short questions, in the chat. It's hard when with lots of text and paragraphs, it's hard for us to parse out questions that folks have for us. I think there are a lot of folks are having a great time talking to each other, which is awesome. We're great, like really glad to have this space. And if you have questions for us that you want us to answer in these next 15 minutes, we want to be able to find those in the chat and answer your questions. So we'll be scrolling through and seeing what questions come up that we can address. And we've got a bunch of time for that. Maybe we can stop Ray's screen sharing so we can see our faces in bigger and then dig into these questions. And all of y'all, feel free to scroll through and see what questions there have been that we maybe haven't gotten to or haven't been answered in the chat, as we potentially get more. We can also pull out, so like David asked, do you see nonprofit employees rejecting being forced to pay dues? And Danny and I addressed this a little bit in the chat, but just to kind of dig into it a little bit more. As Danny said, there are a lot of material benefits that come from unionizing. Usually, you know, salaries, compensation goes up, and usually by a lot more than dues. So, most unions do not require dues until a first contract is ratified. So that all that time that you're spending getting the support of the union staff to organize your union and to win your first contract, you're not paying dues until you actually win that contract and are reaping the benefits of that collective bargaining agreement, and then are paying dues kind of out of that.
And I'll add that, you know, we have something like I think we have around 800 represented staff across organizations right now. And we have 3 people who have not wanted to pay, and that includes people who live in non-right to work states. And so in some places, if you're not in a right to work state, there are agency fees that you're required to pay. But again, the benefits, most people see the tremendous benefits of what we can do with union dues.
Thomas asked in the chat, are you aware of livelihood insurance and what do you think of encouraging unions to bargain for it collectively going forward? I'm not particularly familiar with that concept other than in broad terms. I will say though that there are few limits on what unions can actually negotiate for, within certain material bounds. For folks who are not aware of the concept of bargaining for the common good, that is something that particularly teachers unions in this country have really been instrumental in advancing, which is, bargaining for broader social benefits that go beyond the union. And these are not things that an employer is legally required to even give a response to under the National Labor Relations Act. These are what are sort of called permissive subjects of bargaining. And yet unions have been able to secure these kinds of gains through leveraging the power that they hold collectively through their labor. And so I think, when we're sort of thinking about the kind of ceiling we should set in one of the more progressive sectors in the country, at least nominally, we really do need to start thinking about these kinds of things.
Yeah, I have a good question here too that I can pull out. To this point, Teamsters and stevedores have been organizing the delivery chain, but I don't know that the legislative aides talk with these, nor do the Whole Foods or Party City workers talk with either of those. Are we too siloed? Yes, we are, but we are starting to see a breakdown of those silos. One of the places we're seeing it is, Green Union Hall. People will come to us or people will come to PWU and say, I'm not an environmental group, but I have questions, right? And we help we talk with them about different things that we're accomplishing in our sector. I'll also add that, Progressive Workers Union has been working very closely with the United Auto Workers and SEIU Service Employee Workers. We have had conversations with folks from the Amazon warehouses because, again, that global solidarity across all sectors is what's really needed for all labor forces. You see how brilliantly Sean Fain is able to talk about, in I think it's 2024 or 2026 or 2028, a general strike, global general strike on May Day. And so breaking down those silos is critical and it's starting to happen.
Thanks, CJ. I want to pull out a question that I don't have an answer to, but I think you all will. How is the persistence of union membership? Have any nonprofit unions been decertified? Also, can you name any nonprofits that have been exemplary?
I'm not aware of any that have been decertified, but I'll let others know. But there have been really long fights. Appalachian Voices was absolutely exemplary in how they went about, voluntarily recognizing. I can't remember if it was voluntary or not because that was before my presidency. But they have been really incredibly wonderful to work for, and seeing the extremes of what our current Sierra Club National Unit is going through to negotiate their successor CBA, which our labor attorney referred to as the worst anti-union campaign he has ever witnessed in an organization that already has a contract. And what is happening with the folks at Union Concerned Scientists, Appalachian Voices was really just delightful. And that's the way it should go.
Yeah, I can't think of too many examples of decertification that have occurred. Since sort of 2019, 2020, I think every non-profit union, at least in the climate and environmental sector that I've tracked, has won recognition, which is a pretty amazing strike rate when you compare it to other sectors. The challenge has been bargaining and some of the more sort of belligerent tactics that some employers have taken in bargaining, or even if it's not, overtly belligerent, just hiring outside counsel who were used to more aggressive tactics in the for-profit sector that just end up sort of slowing everything down. And often there are pretty serious issues and pathologies within those workplaces that continue to function over time and can lead to sort of people feeling burnout and staff attrition as a result, which can sometimes, in a worst case scenario, sort of frustrate the initial intention of the union effort. But that is a worst case scenario.
Yeah, I can add, at the Public Interest Network, I was part of the team that I think it was a full year and a half between when the union effort started and we went public to request recognition, and then it took another 3 months to win, well, eventually force voluntary recognition, essentially, and that was that we got in March of 2022. And then I was on the bargaining committee until July, when I left to start a new organization similar to Danny, similar organizational trajectories. But as I said, they're still bargaining, and I believe one person who was in the original organizing effort is still on staff at the Public Interest Network now. So it's a lot of turnover, which that's the, as opposed to, decertification doesn't happen very often, but attrition and the struggle to really keep the energy and momentum level high is really hard when one of the biggest problems is turnover. And then you have to keep organizing new people to be as invested when they just started a new job and they haven't really experienced all of the challenges that are some of the reasons that the union was required in the first place. Santiago is also asking if there's a list of nonprofits with unions. I don't know if there's like a list. That would be great. Maybe we should like compile that somewhere as Green Union Hall and have that a resource available. So we will make a note of that. We can rattle off a bunch, and I know we put some logos up. But I don't know if folks want to share some that maybe haven't been mentioned yet that have unions. I mean, I guess also we mentioned a bunch in the environmental sector, but there are also definitely some nonprofits that are not environmental nonprofits that have also unionized recently.
Yeah, I've not found a comprehensive list anywhere. I think there was a list of like nonprofit unionized nonprofit charities, and they had a pretty big list. But as far as like one comprehensive list, it doesn't exist yet, but we could certainly look for trying to put one of those together.
I started to develop one a few years ago, just focusing on, I can't remember if I was focusing on climate and environmental nonprofits, sort of like green nonprofits. After all, we are the Green Union Hall, or sort of more just sort of like mission or cause-based nonprofits generally. But yeah, there is sort of a definitional question there, because I think the nonprofit sector is the second or third largest sector of employees in the country, because it includes things like schools, hospitals, museums, etc., etc. So it does cover a lot of service sectors that are one or another type of nonprofit. So yeah, you would need to sort of apply some sort of criteria to figure that out. But I think just within our sort of green sector, there are dozens at this point. I would not be surprised if more than 50 had achieved recognition at this stage. I think a few years ago the count was 20 something. So yeah.
But that's a great note that we can definitely work on compiling with some definition. We have another question about saying that at Center for Biological Diversity, the fact that their national union, CWA, Communication Workers of America, represents several legacy police unions became a giant issue within the progressive space of the org. Have others experienced this? One note related to this, I mean, when I was talking to one of my coworkers back at the Public Interest Network to try to get them on board with the union to vote, to sign a card and be supportive, she raised that. She said, unions aren't always forces for good necessarily. A lot of unions have been problematic, keeping police officers or teachers or other folks in spaces where they probably should have been let go from their jobs, protecting folks who have abuse their power in one way or another. And I think, a response there is that that's not inherent to unions. That depends on, the who is being represented and how power structures exist there. And so, of course, we talked about how decentralized power can really be a factor in unions, and the culture you create. And I'm sure other folks, that's just one facet of this, but I know you all, my co-panelists, are going to have other thoughts to contribute here as well, in terms of just like navigating being in unions with other groups of workers.
I would like to just point out that that critique specifically from the Center for Biological Diversity was a left flank attack on unions. It was not a good faith acknowledgement of police unions. And I just know that because I know workers and I know about their campaigns. So I just think that's an important thing to acknowledge, right? Like, we're seeing unprecedented attacks from the left within the nonprofit space. And so even though that's a totally fair thing to criticize and talk about, it really needs to be nested in a good faith argument that's pro-worker. And in that instance, it was not.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I am part of a workplace that is affiliated with the Communications Workers of America, and I also serve roles for my local. And when I was helping organize the staff union of the Civil Liberties Defense Center, that was one of the questions that they had in deciding whether to affiliate with CWA or not. And I think the simplest answer is that is a different local, and just because you have police unions in the local does not mean that police unions dominate that local. It does not mean that that local has any influence or control over your local. Unions are intensely democratic organizations. Sorry, I have some dogs going absolutely crazy behind me, so I might just finish my comment there. Thank you.
I saw another question I think we touched on a little bit in the chat that someone asked. I can see, how management would want someone from the union to talk to, and isn't, labor a democratic instance of democracy in action, something to that effect. So it is very common for us to want to work together, right? It doesn't, like, Progressive Workers Union is very committed to getting rid of the us versus them, management versus labor, right? It's our union, it's our collective bargaining agreement, and it really makes our organization stronger if we work together, right? And it's also subverting that dominant paradigm of colonial traits in workplaces, right? And so we have very specific places, and a lot of contracts will carve out something called the labor management committee, where you can meet together and talk about issues and resolve issues without, outside of the bargaining table. And then we also have spaces that we protect from union leadership, where that power dynamic is still such a risky situation where our members don't quite feel safe and they need to have a space where they can talk. So we kind of use both of those models together to work with management. A lot of times it's nothing like a backdoor conversation or a backdoor deal, but we often have times where union leadership and management will come together, even during like negotiations, and say, like, this is where we're stuck, this is where we're at, what are you trying to solve for, what are you trying to solve for, let's have a conversation off the record and see how we can move together, right? We always honor our membership. Our membership comes first, and their needs and what we're protecting and what we're fighting for. We would never do anything that our membership would not approve of, but we are able to have conversations with managers. There are a lot of managers who are pro-union and really see the benefits of how unions can help shift culture and policies and make it a place that's possible for everyone to thrive together.
I think we're coming up at time here. So I think we might call it an evening. There've been so many great questions. Thanks everyone for engaging so deeply with this topic in the chat and with all your questions. It's been really great to dig into this topic with you all. And as I said, you can find us on Instagram. We do monthly events, so reach out and join into a Green Union Hall monthly event if you're interested. And thanks everyone for coming this evening. Maybe we can put our Green Union Hall email address in the chat, or just once more in case anyone wants to be able to reach us.